Greetings. What I'd like to do in this video is to examine some of the theories that we might use to explain genocide. So we're interested in understanding how different theories explain genocide. And also we would like to look at the strengths and weaknesses of the theories. And behind each theory are a set of assumptions regarding how human behavior takes place, the motivations of human behavior, how to carry out research to understand human behavior or social behavior in that regards. And so there's a variety of theories and also a variety of methods that are used to support or refute the theories. I tend to break up theories into three major categories, and those categories are the psychiatric, medical, and psychopathology models, the social psychological models, and the sociocultural models. So I move from the micro, individual small group models to the group models, and then more toward the sociocultural or the societal nation type models. And we'll see that there are many theories in criminal justice that we could try to apply to genocide, and there are also theories from psychology, anthropology, and political science that we could apply, and there are also specific theories developed just to explain genocides that we will take a closer look at later on in the semester. The first model I'd like to discuss is actually a model developed to address family problems and family therapy. And it's called the Circumplex Model, and it was created by David Olson and his colleagues to help in premarital counseling, in solving family crises and problems, reducing issues in families that lead to bad outcomes. And what I basically did here is took their model and applied these concepts of cohesion, flexibility, and communication patterns to genocidal societies, as if the genocidal society and the different groups within the societies are basically families. And so this model was not developed in any way to understand genocide, but I think some of the concepts are helpful, and later on in my own research I dropped using the Circumplex model, but I retained some of the concepts. And basically the idea here is that there's balanced, unbalanced, and extremely unbalanced families, and the more unbalanced a family, the more problems within the family. The major concepts, though, I think are useful for looking at the society and also looking at the perpetrator group. For example, cohesion focuses on emotional bonding and closeness and loyalty, and this can be balanced or very high or very low. So cohesion is kind of that closeness. Too much cohesion is seen as a problem, not enough cohesion seen as a problem. Flexibility, in contrast, focuses on the ability of the system to change in response to stress. And also there's a focus on leadership, role shifts, and control. And again, that any family or group could be balanced or very high or very low in flexibility. Too much or too little flexibility is seen as a problem. And then communication levels and patterns are also analyzed as well. And what we end up seeing is that problems occur in families and problems occur in societies when we get to the extremes. And so we have enmeshed cohesion, which is excessive emotional closeness, where in this situation, I believe we see genocidal societies, the genocidal perpetrator group becomes enmeshed with each other in this too close, cohesive group where there's punishment for any expression of disagreement or dissent. There's a very high dependence within the perpetrator group and strong connections and identification. And this allows the enmeshed group to identify themselves as one and to begin to identify outsiders who they create this idea that the outsiders are a threat and need to be eliminated. Disengaged cohesion is where you have failure to demonstrate group loyalty and high levels of independence among groups. Rigid flexibility, which is another pattern that I see in genocidal societies, is where you have authoritarian leadership styles from the perpetrators, strict codes of conduct, and rigid rules and regulation. And so you see this being enforced within that cohesive group. So the rigidity in that regard and the cohesion combine to form a very dangerous pattern in genocidal groups. And also in the rigid group, there is a failure to change when confronted with stressors or crisis. And then chaotic flexibility is where the leaders have minimal control over others, and leadership styles change rapidly, and social control is very low. So a lot of the circumplex model that I use focuses on how the perpetrator group becomes more rigid and enmeshed. And so again, I just mentioned this to think about what happens when we get to the the extremes, and especially in the case of a rigidly enmeshed perpetrator group, the dangers there. And there really hasn't been any other work applying the circumplex model to genocide other than some of my earlier work in the late in around 2008 and 2009, and a colleague and I also used the circumplex model to explain torture in prison systems. So there is some use there, I believe, but I think there has to be a translation. But I think focusing on the cohesion, the closeness, and the conflict, and the communication patterns, and the rigidity of thought patterns are very relevant and important in genocide studies. I have a feeling that the family therapy world would rather I did not use the circumplex model to understand genocide, since it is a model that has been empirically shown to help families when applied in family therapy. And so this may be an inappropriate use, but I find some of the concepts useful. And still I'm not sure if I'll be using that in the future or not. But I bring that out to kind of start, because it demonstrates taking, who would think that you take a family therapy theory and then apply it to genocide. And so that's the kind of thinking I want you to, begin to realize is okay in this course and class and in genocide studies. Okay, moving to the medical model, what we have here are very individualized explanations, where basically the idea here is there may be genetic factors, or there may be neurotransmitter dysfunctions or changes that lead to problematic behaviors and patterns, or it may reside in the brain structures. And I have a lot of problems with applying a medical model to genocide, primarily because you're talking about individual changes, not group changes, although some might argue that the structure and functioning of the brain may change due to exposure to stressors, and this may increase maybe a predisposition of people within a group to act out as perpetrators or in violent ways. But I do not use the medical model in my own research, but I certainly want to point that out, since there has been a greater interest in the biosocial and the biological models in criminal justice in the recent years. I did want to mention that, but I'm not convinced the medical model applies to genocide. The sociobiological or evolutionary theory looks at the interaction of biological factors and the environment, and that certain actions interrelate within the environment, creating outcomes. So what we might have here is this whole idea all the way back from the Darwinian school of thought of survival of the fittest and evolutionary survival instinct that has gone very, very wrong. And whether or not this is some kind of adaptive survival feature within the brain that leads to this type of behavior is still obviously questionable, but certainly that sociobiological or evolutionary models have been used to explain group violence and violence in general, and so I would certainly consider taking a look at that particular or those particular models as well. A lot of the sociobiological research focuses on sexual behavior and violent behavior. And so again, that you get kind of the interaction of genetics, hormones, nutrition, and the environmental factors. So it kind of combines the medical model with more social psychological models and sociological models in that sense to look at different patterns of behaviors. I haven't really used the sociobiological models in my own research, but I did want to point out that it exists. Next, the psychoanalytic model developed by Freud looked at early childhood traumas leading to problems and three major personality structures within the individual: the id, the ego, and the superego, where we see this attempt to have this ego which mediates between the id, which are the aggressive and sexual impulses, and the superego, which are societal norms. And when things get unbalanced in that regard, when there's too much id, we run into problems. For example, some would argue that those that are psychopaths have too much id, not enough superego or ego. And those that are super guilty may have too much superego and not enough ego or id in that sense. And then people use what Freud referred to as defense mechanisms to cope with anxiety, such as repression, denial, and regression. And so, this whole idea is that there's these unconscious drives and this conflict between the individual and society, with the ego trying to mediate that. And again, I'm not quite sure how this applies directly to genocide, but certainly it's another model I wanted to point out. I think a lot of the challenges here are to see if these models actually, can be applied to genocide. And the next model I'd like to mention is the authoritarian personality perspective. And this is where you look at the personality primarily of the leader in this case, and how the leader dominates subordinates, and then the subordinates defer to the superiors. And there's also kind of a black and white thinking. It's either this or that. There's a dislike of ambiguity or science. There's a concern about other people's sexual behaviors. And it's based on this whole idea that this authoritarian personality can kind of bully people into other types of behavior. What we find then with the authoritarian personality may be very obedient to those who are higher up on the ladder, and then bully and become violent of those who are seen as lower. And so it's another model to look at. But one of the features we've seen is that, and it's been a criticism of the authoritarian personality model, is that it's focused on authoritarianism, that type of behavior and thought process on the far right, as they say, but not on the far left. And it would seem that if you're looking at authoritarian personality, we'd wonder, would that be, considered like extreme right-wing thinking and extreme left-wing thinking, or how would we conceptualize that? And is it a useful model? And it has been applied by Kressel in his work on genocide and on terrorism, looking at how the authoritarian personality can operate in a variety of settings. Although there are, as I mentioned, problems with that. And this wraps up this video. Thank you.